Today we're going to just do a little bit of comparing of numbers, rational numbers, and also looking at a new term, absolute value. We're going to start with the warm-up. I'm just going to review the warm-up from today. These are inequality symbols, and we want to use these inequality symbols to compare numbers to see if they're greater or less than or equal to one another. So, for example, on this first example, number 1, when I look at negative 15/4, that's a negative in front of it, I want to compare that to negative 2/3. And so on a number line, I just think a little bit of scratch work. If this is 0, and this is 1, 2, 3, negative 2/3 would fall somewhere between 0 and negative 1. So negative 2/3 would fall about there. But negative 15/4, if we remember, we could change that to a mixed number. 4 goes into 15 3 times, so it's going to be a negative 3 with a remainder of 3/4. So that would be beyond negative 3 and before negative 4. So if this is negative 4, negative 15/4 would be about there. So since it's farther to the left, we would say negative 15/4 is less than negative 2/3. Then you just work through the warm-up we did in class like that. So without as much detail, test yourself on those, and you might want to pause this, but then you should be able to check your answers. So 10/6 is positive. Look at number 2 here. 10/6 is positive and negative 15/4 is negative. Positives are always bigger than negatives. Down here, number 3, 10/6 and 1 2/3 are positive. So 10/6 goes into 6 goes into 10 once. There's a remainder of 4. Add a 6. 4 6 reduces to 2/3. So this would be a situation where we would equal. And then the last problem, number 4. 1 2/3 compared to negative 1 2/3. Positives are always greater than negatives. The next thing that we talked about in class was, what does the term absolute value mean? And we added this page to our notebook, or this page here, because one of the big challenges when we learn something new is being able to speak about it. So when you see a number inside 2 straight lines like that, what you say, the way you read this is the absolute value of negative 3. In other words, you don't talk about the lines. You don't say this number negative 3 is in the lines. You look at something like this and you just say the absolute value of 4, because that's what's inside the bars. Over here you would say the absolute value of 2. Down here you would say the absolute value of 4.3. This is the absolute value of negative 3 3/5. Not sure if that's big enough for you to see. So that's how you read that. The next thing is to think about what it means. Anytime you see an absolute value symbol, you want to think about how far away the number inside is from 0. So if we take this example over here and think about 0 on a number line, negative 3 is to the left of 0, and it's 3 units away. So we say that the absolute value of negative 3 is just 3, because that's how many units it is from 0. Similarly, with the absolute value of 4, if I put 0 here, 4 would be over here. So 4 is 4 units away from 0. So the absolute value of 4 is just 4. So absolute value is not about opposites, it's about distance. This distance is always a positive number. So looking over on the right side of the paper, when we look at the absolute value of 2, and we think about it on the number line, it's 2 jumps away from 0, it's 2 units away. And if I look at the absolute value of negative 2, it's the exact same distance. It's 2 jumps away from 0, it's just in the other direction. So what we can conclude is the absolute value of 2 is equal to the absolute value of negative 2. They're both equal to 2. If I wanted to plot a point like this on the number line, it would be okay for me to put a point and put an arrow and say this is the absolute value of negative 2. Or I could put a point and put an arrow and say this is equal to the absolute value of positive 2. And over here, I could put another point and another arrow and say this is about where the absolute value of 4.3 is. And similarly, the absolute value of negative 3 3/5, that's just equal to 3 3/5. So, the absolute value of negative 3 3/5 would really correspond to a point over here. Normally you don't plot absolute value points on a number line, but you do want to think about questions in relationship to a number line. So one example that I did today in our comp book was, after we talked about the vocabulary, we just looked at what points correspond to what line, what spot on this number line down here. And I can see, I'm going to pause this and split this up. So what you might see in your questions is something more along the lines of these. Which point corresponds to the absolute value of negative 2? Well, we know the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And so when looking over on the second page, A would be the point that corresponds to that. Which point corresponds to the absolute value of positive 2? Well, the absolute value of positive 2 is also equal to 2. So those both have the same answer. You might see something like number 3. Which point corresponds to the opposite? So we haven't talked a lot about opposites, but opposites you talked about in elementary school. So which point corresponds to the opposite of 5/8? Well, 5/8 would be between 0 and 1. So this point G is 5/8. So the opposite of 5/8 would be on the other side of 0. So the opposite of 5/8 would be negative 5/8. So the point that corresponds to the opposite of 5/8 is F. That's this point right here. Similarly, which point corresponds to the opposite, and I don't know if you can see there's a negative there, of negative 2, negative 1.2. Negative 1.2 would be somewhere in between negative 1 and negative 2. So the opposite of negative 1.2 would be positive 1.2. And that would be right about here. So that's a tricky question because we're asking for the opposite of negative 1.2. So that would have to be on the other side of 0. So the opposite of negative 1.2 is positive 1.2. And then the last question we did in class is which point is neither positive nor negative? And we would say that C, 0, is neither positive or negative. And the best way to think about that is that 0 has no opposite. So then it can't be negative, nor can it be positive.